Well, good morning, everyone. My name is Mark DeMoss from the Mosaics Global Network. I'm joined by my colleagues Harry Lee and Alison Clinton here in Little Rock, Arkansas. And we're talking church planting this morning in the midst of a crisis. Church planting in the midst of a crisis. I can't imagine what it would be like to be a church planter in this moment. In fact, let me tell you one story I heard just a couple of days ago out of Phoenix, Arizona. A team from Wisconsin, I think it was 10 to 15 people, I was told, by other church planters that I'm coaching there. This team has been on the ground in Phoenix, Arizona, in the valley for almost a year. And literally, they were going to launch their church. It was either last Sunday on Palm Sunday or Easter Sunday coming up. And the bottom line is they've packed their bags. They've gone home. That church plant, dead in the water, gone an entire year of time. I don't want to say wasted, but it didn't come to fruition because of this crisis. And that's probably a story that's amplified across the country. Others, like Inés and Bobby, Dale and Oneya Okuwobi, perhaps others of you are hanging in there and adapting, finding agility, resilience, and figuring out a way to come out of this on the other side, still engaged with the church plant, with the people you're already engaged with, and ultimately not just survive, but thrive down the road. So we're talking church planting in the midst of this crisis. And again, joined by our good friends, Inés Velasquez-McBryde and Bobby Harrison, who are out in Monrovia, California. Their website, by the way, you can see on Harry, The Church We Hope For is their website. And we want to just welcome you, Inés and Bobby, to the conversation today. Thanks for being with us. Hey, I want to start real quick with you guys. Inés, Bobby, just talk to us, if you would, briefly about your calling and the vision for the church you set out to plant.
We are trying to plant a multi-ethnic and intergenerational and socioeconomically diverse church here in Southern California. And Bobby and I are the two co-lead pastors. We're doing that intentionally in order to subvert all the things that otherwise would divide us. I am a female Latina, and Bobby is a white male from the South. And we want to plant a church that is intentionally multi-ethnic with the values of racial reconciliation, love and justice and mercy. And of course, we've developed that theology because I helped plant Mosaic Church 20 years ago, and Bobby also has been involved in churches in transformation, predominantly white church, that have wanted to turn and become more multi-ethnic. And so that is a desire to do it here in Southern California.
And you all met, I guess, a fellowship, right, Bobby, at North Little Rock, a church here at North Little Rock Fellowship Bible, right?
Yes, sir. Fellowship in North Little Rock. Yep. Yeah.
So talk to us about your calling and your sense. I know Inés, as she mentioned, with Harry and Alison and I, we literally started Mosaic Church in the summer of 2001. She was not too far removed, I think, from TCU and the Horned Frogs there, right? Yes. So she's been at it quite a while. But Bobby, tell us about quickly your vision for a multi-ethnic church and ultimately to plant with Inés.
So I was a part of a church at North Little Rock Fellowship North that in the mid-2000s made a big move from being a homogeneously white church for 23 years to being a church that was pursuing with great intentionality multi-ethnic ministry across the board. And so I was a part of that vision. I was a part of that whole process where we saw this church try to take the turn because they got a glimpse of the good news and needed to act that out. So that sealed something in my heart that I've never been able to let go, and that just lit a flame. And 10 years ago, Inés and I just began to develop a friendship. We are both married, but not to one another. Our spouses are dear friends. We share tables together. Our kids play together, have sleepovers, all those good things. And we just realized there was this kindred partnership thing that was happening that we could tell that God was using something to knit our lives together. Our spouses could tell, our friends could tell. We just didn't know what to do with it. We both headed off to seminary at different times. And then after seminary, for me, I went back home to North Little Rock for a while and realized, oh no, my heart was still in California where I'd been to seminary. And so we came back with this hope and this mission to be rooted to the people that God had knit our hearts to here on the West Coast. A couple of things that are particular about Inés and I's partnership, and as she mentioned, maybe two of the most polarized bodies in our country at such a time as this. Yeah. We want to bring together this embodied expression of the good news that God has put inside of us as woman and man serving side by side, really disrupting what we see as power structures in our world that the Lord Jesus Christ has torn that dividing wall of hostility down, and to say, no, women and man, they can come together and they can serve side by side as an elevated expression of the good news. And then alongside of that, one of the things that I think is maybe most unique about Inez and I is that we're dear friends. We've been friends for the past decade. And friendship is not a word that's thrown out much when you think about vision and values of a church, but it's right at the forefront of a lot of what we do. We want to see redeemed friendship. Not just, oh, you're in my small group, we go to church together, we sit by each other sometimes. We want to see this pursue in multi-ethnic ministry of real friendship, friendship that we see in the scriptures from cover to cover.
Yeah, what a blessing that is. Obviously, a lot of teams form for a variety of reasons, but to form out of relationship and friendship, shared values right from the start, what a blessing that is. So let's talk for a moment about where you both were in terms of the process. Where were you in the process in terms of your own church plant in California? Let's back it up to, I guess, about 3.5 weeks ago, mid-March, somewhere in there is when the dominoes began to fall. In fact, Harry and I were in California. I was supposed to speak at Pepperdine in Chapel on a Thursday. They called me late Wednesday night and said, hey, we're canceling and sending kids home. And that's when the dominoes fell. So in terms of your church plant and your journey, where were you several weeks ago, just prior to those dominoes falling, if you will, and then catch us up on where you're at today?
Yeah, we were we often use the pregnancy motif, so sorry about that, but we have been like in the first or second trimester of this baby church growing. And so we've had a core group that we have been meeting and doing life together for years. And they've been friends through seminary the past 3.5 years. But the past 8 months, perhaps, we have been doing life together more intentionally, specifically about this calling. And then something happened in December, and we felt a turn. We felt an invitation of the Spirit to begin meeting in a home, in a living room, in a home, and to live into Acts 1 and 2 in January. So January and February, we had started meeting and opening up to more of a corporate gathering. So very, very bare bones, very much beginning living into Acts 1 and Acts 2, hospitality and testimony and the word and table fellowship. And that's where we have been when all of this started, right when COVID started around, 3.5 weeks ago, for at least here for Southern California. We've been on lockdown since then.
Mm-hmm. So Bobby, with that in mind, did you have a launch date in mind? Like, where were you headed to this point? Was there a launch date, September, August? What were you thinking in terms of your timeline?
Yeah, the fall was definitely just in our minds, the hope and the ambition. Meanwhile, just trying to stay steady in tune with the Spirit along the way and to see what the momentum begins to take shape as we were in those home gatherings. I think that's what we felt, and maybe church planners across the world feel this right now too, is that January, there was something that began to stir. And then February came and you're like, ooh, okay, something good is forming here. And then March. And so we felt like this thing that we were building and just rolling with and beginning to go, okay, there's some momentum that could begin to carry and that could lead us into the fall. It just stopped. So we're really sitting in that right now without a perfect response, without this immediate, like, all right, strategy, playbook, what's the right thing to do right now? We don't have that guide. So we're really just sitting in the midst of it right now with the Spirit, just trying to ask day to day, what does this look like?
Well, we're going to talk more about that. Again, you're watching Inés Velasquez-McBryde Bobby Harrison, church planners in California, with us this morning, talking about church planting in the midst of a crisis. And we're going to get deeper into that. We'll be joined by others along the way as well. But I want to give a shout out, Greg Kappas, who was our coach way back almost 20 years ago. Inez, Greg's listening and participating on the webinar today. He wants you to know he's encouraging. In fact, he said, you rock it, Inez and Bobby. Stay focused on your mission from Jesus. Don't give up. Praying for you all. Love the friendship motif. That's from Greg Kappas. You know, Anthony Valley, right here in the Central Arkansas, he definitely wants to weigh in and say hello. Paul Park also saying good morning this morning. By the way, if you have thoughts, questions, you want to say hello, we'll get them in throughout the morning. So again, to chat, do that on the webinar on Zoom, or you can just post on Facebook and Alison will pick those up and we'll get your comments, feedback, thoughts, questions, whatever. Bobby, you were talking about how this COVID crisis, interrupted. It just shut it down. There's momentum building, there's table fellowship, there's home meetings, and all of a sudden 3.5 weeks ago, so it just stops, it ceases. So with that in mind, how that's one way your plans have been interrupted, but are there other ways your plans have been interrupted? And ultimately, the question is, how are you adapting right now? How are both you and Inez adapting, both personally as well as in terms of your corporate mission to plant a church?
Yeah, I think a lot of us are taking a lot of walks right now around the neighborhood. I've seen neighbors I've never seen before. I've seen people that I'm like, I don't know if you even have walked on that sidewalk ever in your life. And a lot of people out there. I was on a walk the other day and just thinking through this process, and 3 C's came to mind because I'm a preacher first. So, it's got to have 3 C's. Connectivity, creativity, and collaboration. These are 3 words that just began to rise in the spirit. So I'll just touch on them a little bit. And Inez, if you want to pick some of the pieces up along the way. Connectivity is this idea of maybe not connected solely based on this device right here, the device, whatever is streaming us right now. But when I think about connectivity, I think about relational interaction with people, and I think about participatory involvement and engagement. So Inez and I, as we tried to think about how to minister during this time to a flock, we're trying to think of how do we actually connect, not just communicate and not just produce something, especially something that will just be consumed, but how do we connect in a way that'll invite people to participate with us? So we'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. The aspect of that, though, that leads into it is creativity. And so each week we're putting our heads together thinking, okay, this doesn't fit in the same box as normal. What does it look like for us now? How can we create an opportunity for people to engage right now with each other and with God? So the first week when it came out, what we did is we just did a reflective prayer exercise. I grabbed my guitar, she grabbed her Bible, and we connected on Zoom just like this and recorded a session of Inez leading us through a reflective prayer, and then me pleading some worship in and through the process, but saying, don't just watch this. In fact, if you're only going to be able to watch this, come back sometime later when you could watch this and engage with it, when you could actually walk through the prayer exercise. We recorded another thing that was a prayer walk through our neighborhood. And we said, hey, when you have an opportunity, get your phone, get some earbuds, and then let us take you on a prayer walk through your neighborhood. And so it was an opportunity for us to go, people are walking right now, but we're doing a lot of walking. Are we doing walking with the Spirit through our neighborhoods in a way that maybe we haven't? So just trying to spark that creativity. And then the last part of it is collaboration. A lot of times collaboration is not possible because of time and because of geography. Hey, I would love for you to be a part of what we're doing at our church on Sunday, except we have the same meeting times or we're distant from each other and we can't do that. Those things that normally would keep us apart from collaborating with one another, they're not there anymore. We have a lot more margin to connect. So this past Sunday, Inez preached for a church called La Fuente in Pasadena, a bilingual church, a beautiful relationship with these pastors in their church. And so they recorded the worship and the announcements and the hosting and led the church in the communion. And then Inez recorded the sermon and they put it all together. And so especially when I think about church planters, when I think about small churches, maybe without the same resources as others, this is a time where collaboration could come in ways that I'm not sure we've even tapped yet, not even tapped the surface of. And that's what do you think?
Yeah, those 3 words are great that Bobby came up with, and they're frameworks, they're lenses that we can look at our ecclesiology and our missiology, right? And so connectivity, I think all of us have been, again, we are having to, we're going through a season of disorientation and reorientation in regards to how does a church connect? Anybody can communicate, but not everybody can connect. And so connectivity in a gathered community. A gathered community is a space to belong, and it's just a space for identity formation, and it's an incubator for calling. And so how are we doing this at the individual level and group level? Well, right now, so many things have been stripped from us. And so like Bobby was alluding to, how can we still connect with our core group? And right now, we have been so stripped down that to the bare bones, to where just asking how somebody is doing, do they have food, do they have toilet paper, do they have the basic essentials, is vital right now. And it's the work of the gospel, and it's holy work, and it seems so basic, but we're trying to keep up with our families to be sure that they're just alive. And that is important, especially if you're trying to plant a socioeconomically diverse church already in places where there are health disparities along ethnicity. That is very important, that some people will have even further food insecurity or further health problems. So it's important for us to be in tune to the Spirit, to all factors that could threaten somebody's life to where they're not surviving, to where they're not flourishing. And then creativity, you know, they say necessity is the mother of all inventions. We have that saying in Spanish too. Creativity as to missional engagement. So for example, the first offering that we took up in January at our church was actually not for us. Maybe that was a bad idea, but the first offering that we took up was to support the Immigration Resource Center here in Monrovia, California. And that is a resource center to help, immigrants and asylum seekers, because we're just down the border. And it was a ministry that started from Mountainside Communion Church, which is a Nazarene church. Their pastor has been a professor of Bobby and I's, and something that we have wanted to do in any city until we discern what city we're going to be planting. Our desire for Bobby and I is to see God's activity in the city that has already been happening before we even come into the scene. And so to have that collaboration with other churches to see what God has already been doing and how do we join in that mission. And so that missional engagement, rather than us starting something from scratch, we see what Mountainside Communion is doing with the IRC, with the Immigration Resource Center. So we bought some gift cards, because right now, those who are most marginalized right now would be those people that are not able to apply for unemployment or are not able to have access to services, especially during a crisis like this. And so what's something that we can do from home? We have to be creative. And so we dropped off those gift cards maybe a couple of weeks ago to the IRC. And so we're having to be creative with our missional engagement. And we also have to ask, what resources do we already have in people here right now? So because we have people, Bobby and I are not the church. The full body of Christ is the church. We have people who are already doing things, and they are extensions of the church, and they're signposts of the kingdom. So another thing that we're doing right now is, one of our members is a hospital chaplain. And we said, hey, Justin, what can we do to support you right now? How is the hospital? How are you doing? He said, oh man, right now we could use some encouragement. The other hospital chaplains, both Jewish and Christian chaplains, are just, under severe stress, and they're having to go in. We don't have masks to take, care of ourselves. So we're sending them an art piece as an encouragement. We're sending them notes of encouragement, and also non-surgical masks as well. And so we're having to be really creative with what we have and what we can do from home. But if you look, you already have a lot of resources in the people of your church. And collaboration, the last word that he alluded to, it's kind of like what we're doing right now. A couple of weeks ago, Bobby and I were on a Zoom call of local church pastors of small churches, and how can we pull together the resources. And that's a huge way, as you know, to break down walls in a city, to remember that this is our city, that this is our church, and it goes from me to we kind of collaboration, and that's missional engagement.
Yeah, you made me think while you were talking about the adaptation. That was really what we were talking about in light of momentum being stalled, and then a pivot to what is in the interim of what will be. You talked about missional and personal and relational, right? That it's missional, personal, relational engagement along the lines. I love those words: connectivity, creativity, and collaboration, and to trust the Lord that in that, like Bobby, you talked about content or productivity earlier, that God is using that. Like it may not be big, it may not be all that, but in those one-on-one interactions, the relational, the missional, the personal connections, that God is going to use that, is using that, and will use that as a foundation for what lies ahead. Hey, Charles Wilson, the church planner up in Roanoke, Virginia. He's like, what's up, fam? He's a good brother. Good to have you with us today, Charles. Also, Yvette is with us. Alex Diaz says hello. Kent Mariashi from up in Seattle, Washington. Kent Mariashi says hello. Yvette is, of course, in Metro DC. And I want to pivot right now to a question that we've already gotten a couple of questions about this, but let's get into the nitty gritty of finance and funding. This is not a time, I would, generally speaking, that there is a time, I should say, where there's tightness in the home, economically, personally, people getting money, keeping money, worried about the future. It's not necessarily a time where it's like, oh, hey, please buy this product or send us this check. That is very difficult, I know, for any church right now, but certainly for church planters. In fact, let me just throw out this. I did a poll 2 weeks ago, almost 200 responded pastors, and I asked 4 questions. I said, where is your church financially right now? And there's the 4 possibilities. One is we're struggling right now. We're struggling to stay afloat. The other was we could go 1 to 3 months, the other 4 to 12 months, and the others were going to be fine. Almost 50%, it was like 35, 38% said we are struggling right now in this moment to keep the doors going. Another 10% or so were in the second category, 1 to 3 months. That mirrors a poll, a very similar poll that Tom Rayner found. And so I feel pretty safe. Out 700 people I know, pastors have been already polled on this, that 40 to 50% of churches cannot go more than a month to 3 months as of right now. And at least half of those are struggling from week to week. So this isn't a problem only for church planters right now. It's a problem for the collective American church. And it was already a problem, which is why Harry and I wrote the book, The Coming Revolution in Church Economics, Why Tithes and Offerings Are No Longer Enough and What You Can Do About It, published by Baker back in October. The need for economic disruption of our model, it was imperative before this crisis and accelerated by it. So we called it The Coming Revolution. And we talked about government perhaps getting involved in taxing property or taking away tax exempt status. We talked about 12 to 22% of jobs being displaced by AI or automation by 2030, according to Oxford. We couldn't have predicted that a virus, a deadly virus, would accelerate that revolution from 3 to 10 years to like 3 to 10 months, right? So all of us are having to adjust, but let's talk nitty gritty of church planting and funding. First of all, and try to think broader than yourselves, but of course, tell your story. But where are you at with that? What are your concerns? What are your anxieties, if you will? Of course, we cast those on the Lord, but how are you navigating funding and finance right now? And what principles might you share for others in a similar boat, particularly church planters?
I certainly can say that I will not have all the answers to such a complicated problem, and I can share my story. In our story, Bobby and I have the blessing right now that we're bivocational pastors, and so that has been perhaps a little more helpful in a time that we didn't have a full staff yet, and we didn't have a full production team. We didn't have a lot of things because we are in our beginning stages of church planting. And so I'm a chaplain at Fuller Theological Seminary. Bobby is a teacher, a professor of Bible at a Christian school. And so we started like this actually intentionally to be bivocational at the beginning with the hope that we would become full-time pastors of our church. And so we are and were and are in the middle of finding partner churches. One of our partner churches is Quest Church in Seattle, and I know Mosaic as well has supported us just because of the long relationship that we've had, obviously 20-year relationship. And Bobby and I were trying to connect with other local church pastors to help us launch. And so all of that is on pause right now. But I cannot even imagine, even as we see the effects of this virus on just employment in general. Fuller Seminary has seen the effects of that and just all over the place. And so right now, I'm thinking how the church can come together also. I've seen already 2 grants that came to my attention yesterday for larger churches who have more funding to perhaps help smaller churches just stay afloat, And so I wonder what the Spirit is inviting us into. And that was one word that it's been jumping in my head. The word interruption seems so perilous and dangerous and risky, but I wonder how this interruption is an invitation from the Spirit in the Spirit's creativity. When we look at the book of Acts, what did they do in times of crisis? I'm encouraged to see that in the early church, in times of other plagues, for example, it was the church that responded with care and compassion and mercy in different parts of the world. And so we have to be so creative with the Spirit. I don't have all the answers because every church will be different and every context will be different. For us, we have had to just lay low for a minute and just wait to see what the Spirit is doing and what he is inviting us into and into whose lives he's taking us, and what those partnerships will be with other churches in the area where you can pull resources together to stay afloat. And like Bobby was saying, for example, the joint service that we had last Sunday, could more of that happen? Should we have been doing that all along? Maybe more of that. So I don't know if Bobby, if you have any thoughts about that as well.
Yeah, I mean, just on a very vulnerable, just allowing people into our story, January was when we were beginning to knock on those doors. We spent the first 6 months here really getting our feet settled, knowing as church planners, not rushing right into it from the thing that we previously were walking into, giving our space or some time, some space to breathe, and then going, okay, let's begin to try to find those partners with resources that could really walk with us. And then that was just interrupted. And that's a loss. So I just want to acknowledge if anybody else is walking in that right now or is living in that was a real tangible loss. It's not something that we can just get up and just kind of brush ourselves off and then go fix it to the next thing. We're living in the midst of loss at the moment. And it's really, really challenging. We're also seeking denominational affiliation. That's been a long, slow, steady process. But even that mutual discernment process that takes place with that, the assessments and all of those things are on pause now too. So that was potentially part of the hope. Part of the vision was that some of that would even begin to come to take fruition down the road. Even that's on pause right now. So this idea of collaboration, of shared resources, of really hoping that the Spirit moves in some of that. And then the other thing that comes to mind is really an invitation for people to still find a way to live in generosity, even in the midst of scarcity. I think that's something that God has always knit in my family's heart. We've never had much, but what God's given us, we have found ways to give, and we've always asked God, give us enough to be able to give to others. And so when people from the outside can look in and see, when we're always in a place like this across the globe of a pandemic, how could you possibly still give to others out of resources? So to invite people to live in the midst of generosity, trusting that God will provide, even in a place of scarcity.
Well, I heard Neil Cole yesterday talking about 3 types of churches that are what's going to happen in terms of economics right now. Some are going to close their doors. I predict, I've already said that a few weeks ago, I hope it's not true, but I do believe that come the 1st of May and into the month of May, you're going to start seeing church layoffs, suspending of operations for a number of churches. Other churches will make it just fine, but then other churches are going to emerge in a totally different space in terms of their understanding of economics. And so you've mentioned bivocational or co-vocational type ministry in the moment, potentially denominational affiliation. These are some adaptations in the moment. Real quick, if you're listening to this conversation intently about economics, there's 4 key questions you've got to ask in this moment. Number 1 is personally for you, how can I cut expenses in my own household? You've got to take some burden off the church. If you're in ministry leadership, you say, where can I cut expenses personally? Secondly, you think about, is there anything I can do to generate income in this moment? You're talking about being a chaplain at Fuller or Bobby teaching at a school. Is there anything that I can do to generate income? And theoretically, if I can cut expenses and or generate income based on my life experience, connections, people that have need in this moment for services I might be able to provide. Let's just say I could cut expenses and generate up to $1,000 a month income right now on my own. What I could do to the church is lessen my salary by $1,000 and take the burden off the church by doing what I can do. Tell the church, you can lower my salary by $1,000 a month. And then, of course, the church can keep a record of that. And someday I could get that as back pay, or even half of it would be beneficial. But that is something you can do. Thirdly, you've got to ask yourself, how can we cut ministry expense in this moment to, again, help the church ride this out? And ultimately, the 4th and key question, not just for this moment, but for the future, is essentially the one Harry and I address in the book, The Coming Revolution in Church Economics. How do you restructure your economic understanding of the church to create multiple streams of income, by leveraging assets, people, money, and buildings to bless the community and advance mission, but at the same time generate some measure of sustainable income. So tithes and offerings, grants and donations through a nonprofit, and also creating for-profit business enterprise that blesses the community, creates jobs, helps to lower crime, repurposes abandoned property. And those three buckets become the funding source of the church, not just one bucket of tithes and offerings. That, again, is in the book, The Coming Revolution in Church Economics. Hey, Mont Mitchell, one of our board members, says hello to you, Inez and Bobby. Seth Martin, a church planter up in Minnesota, also weighing in. He's listening very intently to the conversation this morning. Heather Utley, hi, Mosaics. Thanks for organizing this conversation. And says, we're on the same timeline as Inez and Bobby, having just moved to our neighborhood to plant last child. They identify so much, Heather Utley, with what you all are saying this morning. Hey, Harry, I want to bring up next, let's get Dale and Oneya Okuwobi on the line if we could. Can you patch them in, as they say? It sounds very technical, but patch them into our conversation if you would. And let's have a few thoughts with them. Dale and Oneya, good friends of ours. Hello, welcome to the call. We're so glad to have you on this morning. I know you've been on and listening and participating and with us this morning. Y'all are planning up in Cincinnati, very similar, multi-ethnic, economically diverse church, missional and engagement, just like Inez and Bobby. I know y'all have known each other and met, but you've been listening to this conversation. Dale and Oneya, talk to us about briefly what you're doing, let folks know, and then how are some of the ways you're having to innovate and adapt, whether in terms of ministry adaptation and or financial adaptation, given this COVID-19 crisis?
Well, good morning, all. It's great to be with you. It's great to see our great friends, family online. So this is fantastic. So as you mentioned, we moved back to Cincinnati in 2018 to begin planting a church. Our church is based around three key pillars, having teams that are made up with people with all of the fivefold ministry gifts, being deeply involved in our communities and allowing people to express leadership and incarnate exactly where they live, and then love and unity, standing against any form of bias that positions one group of person above another. And so we have been living into that for the past couple of years. The great news is that we were able to begin building community for a year before this happened, which has provided us some form of advantage that people already have started developing these relationships and want to continue these relationships. So we've had good success of pivoting online and being able to continue having our prayer meetings. We even monthly, one of our big events is that we have a dinner party where people get together, we eat good food, and we have a spiritual conversation, even spiritual for those who are maybe not following Christ yet, but are just interested in talking about spiritual things. So we moved that online. People were showing their plates and saying, this is what I whipped up for dinner. And we're able to continue that conversation. So while things have changed, and while, yes, our momentum towards our public launch in September is different, we're still seeing all sorts of life happen. I think what was said earlier was fantastic in terms of geography not being a boundary anymore, because we have folks in different cities who are now regularly able to connect and who really feel completely like part of our community. So for every change and every interruption that has been sustained through this, we have continued to try to find the good things and move forward together united.
I agree. Yeah.
Yeah. So you mentioned this, Dale. I think I saw on one of your social media platforms recently that you were looking ahead as church planners to a launch in the fall, like an official launch, if you will. But I think I read something about you're like, hey, that's off. We've launched. Maybe I'm getting that wrong, but talk to us about that moment. Again, we talked with Bobby and Inez about this disruption in the moment, given COVID-19 and the plans and the march forward. But talk to us about what you meant by that comment and how that's going.
Yeah, sure. So, that comment just, in my days at Mosaic, anyone who worked at Mosaic, they are a team that's on the move, right? When something happens, you literally just have to respond in that moment. And when I was thinking about our launch, fall 2020, something in my heart just said, COVID has launched you. This is your launch. You're not going to wait till fall 2020. Get moving. The wave, and I think in your book Disruption, you had one of your books, you had an analogy of a wave coming and it knocked someone's chair off, and they had to I'm like, the wave is here, and we have to get moving. And so in that moment, I transitioned to begin to think, this is our launch, this is our moment. Take whatever resources that you have right now and manage that well. Be accountable for every penny, be accountable for every relationship, be accountable for every single thing, and take what you have and do something, figure it out. The other reason why I went to that mindset is this. When you talk about finances, once fall 2020 hits, who am I going to ask for money to raise funds, right? I mean, just realistically, yes, I can ask, but if I think I'm just going to turn this thing up in fall 2020 and start thinking people are going to have expendable income to give, very few people will be able to still give in fall 2020. A lot of churches will be still recovering. And so for me, taking the realistic approach that this is your launch, go for it, move in this season, and then when fall 2020 comes, you can kind of have a celebration, but this is your moment. Don't miss it waiting till fall 2020, because there's so much ministry happening now. And I just kept thinking, this is the question that I think it haunts me. What will I do during this coronavirus as a whole church community? What is our responsibility? And so that's why we've said it's launched us.
Yeah, that's great. The conventional wisdom is launch big. No, it's launch small. That's the reality. You're going to have to launch small, which, by the way, and we won't get into this today, is again completely disruptive, as we've done at Mosaic. It's not about a big launch. Big launch is all rooted in a past model of church funding, butts in the seat. The more people that attend your church, the more revenue you generate. That is already going away. It was already going away in terms of before COVID. It will in the future due to income disparity, changing demographics. There's many, many reasons why butts in the seat does not necessarily guarantee you more income in the future. And that's, again, why Harry and I wrote that book. Topic for another day. But both you, Dale and Oneya, Inez and Bobby, both of you talked about using the resources you have. And that really speaks to a mindset of abundance, right? Not of scarcity. Oh man, if we only had this, we could do it. If this person or if this was and that kind of thinking for church planting in general, especially during this time of crisis, that is the death knell. You cannot think with a mindset of scarcity and not do things based on what you don't have or who you don't have. You have to think with a mindset of abundance and do things with what you do have and who you have, who God's brought you. Again, it's not about launching small, but just playing with what you've got, if you will. Right. And that's a very adaptive practice in this moment. So I'll just throw it out to the four of you, just one or two, you want to weigh in on that, this idea of leveraging the resources, the assets, the people you have now, instead of thinking about what you don't have, leveraging those to use right now.
Yeah, I'd like to point to this piece of art that I have right here. It was made by a Nicaraguan artist, and I have named her Lydia. This woman that's by the river reminds me like Lydia in the book of Acts. Lydia in the book of Acts was not bothered at all by the fact that there was no synagogue in Philippi. She went to the river. That was the resource that she had. And at the river with the women, they prayed and they worshiped God until Paul and Silas came along and shared the rest of the gospel with them. And then Lydia, in her entrepreneurial spirit, became the first home church leader and house church leader, and her house became a base of operations that supported Paul and Silas's ministry for years to come. And we wouldn't have the book of Philippians if it hadn't been for Lydia, who was worshiping and praying and maybe washing by the river like the Nicaraguan women. And so we have to learn that the resources, like we have to look at Acts 1 and Acts 2 and the whole book of Acts to see how did the church do it? What did they have? When we look at Acts 2:42 that we often quote, they said they pulled all their resources together. Greg Kappas in the chat was kind of reminding us a little bit about that, how they just got together in homes and then they got together in corporate worship as well. But they looked at what they had and that was abundant, right? Mm. And so when we think with a Western mentality, we forget that we already have a lot. And Lydia was unbothered by the fact that there was no building. The church was happening at the river. And that's where the power was. The power was in prayer. I think back to times of crises in my Nicaraguan church growing up. I'm the daughter and the granddaughter of a pastor. And in the earthquake of 72 in Nicaragua, I remember the mothers of the church, the matriarch of the church saying, oh yeah, the walls fell down, but we met under a tree, right? And so under the tree, the women of the church were feeding the people. They were cooking and feeding the people. That may seem like, well, that's just really basic and really small. Well, that was church. You feed the bodies and you feed the souls. We're having to unlearn so much of what we have been taught and how we have been socially conditioned to create this production on a Sunday morning. And I think the Spirit is inviting us to look into the book of Acts of how we can be creative now with the abundance that we do have.
That's fantastic. Anybody else want to weigh in on that?
Yeah, I think what I would add to that, number one, what you said about a mindset of abundance and looking at what you have, I think that goes hand in hand with being a multi-ethnic church. For years, communities of color in this country, due to structural disadvantages, have had to look for what do we have in the community and what can we use? And so having groups of people in our church from different backgrounds just allows that kind of thinking to be prevalent all the time. The other thing I would say is in this time, this idea of incarnate where you are, be the church where you are, and that our job becomes how do we help our people be the church wherever they are. We have a wonderful couple in our church who was concerned when this first broke out because they were looking at a neighborhood that was across the way from them and saying, you know, how do we help that neighborhood? How do we do something in that neighborhood? It seems like they would have lack. And we were able to encourage them, just be Jesus exactly where you are. And very tragically, very sadly, somebody in their building actually passed away. And so they now are taking that tragedy and they are providing comfort to their neighbors. They're sewing face masks for the workers in their building. They're able to incarnate and be Jesus where they are. And we want to be the ones, the chief cheerleaders, encouraging and resourcing our people to do that at this time.
Yeah, it goes back. Oh, go ahead. I'm sorry.
If I could just interject one thought here, because I love the thinking. You know, and another thought about not just having a mindset of scarcity, but really having a mindset of sowing in this time, because the way that we've been talking about it, the light switch isn't just going to be flipped on. It's going to be like a dimmer that's going to come, and the sun's going to be rising essentially off the horizon. And so if you can sow what we've been saying, and what has happened is, as we keep saying, that we're going to do as much as we can, as long as we can, keeping in mind public safety and our workers and our volunteers. But what that has done in the community, one, has garnered us so much favor, because people see we're still ministering and we're still sowing into the community. And we've gotten gifts from people we haven't seen in a while, and just, you know, where there's just been these blessings out of just our desire to keep sowing. So really be as intentional and creative about that sowing aspect, and just constantly be thinking, how much can I do? Can I keep doing as much as we can? And then secondly, shameless plug for those of you watching, you know, that we got Bobby and Inez's website on here. And if those of you that do have and are able to bless, you can go to the churchwehopefor.com/give and bless these teams as they continue to trust God for all this. But I know that Inez has lived through this many times back in the early days, because there were times where we only had $1.98 in our own checking account. So hopefully you're well prepared for stuff like this as we go on.
If you can send $1.98 right now.
That's right. They'll take it.
They'll
take it. Hey, and Oneya and Dale, we want to get you involved in that. If you'll text us a website for you too, we'll post that on the screen as well. I want to encourage people. Here's a couple couples planting churches right now that are totally trustworthy, doing a great job, have a great heart, right spirit, healthy, multi-ethnic, economically diverse, missional communities of faith. If you can or desire to support them, there's many others. please do as you go that. You know, I thought, as Harry, you were talking about, it took me back to the start of this time together where we talked about personal and relational and missional. Right now, sowing and reaping, Galatians 6, 7, 8, right? Be not deceived, God is not mocked. Whatever a man sows, this will he also reap, right? And there's two laws of sowing and reaping. One is you reap what you sow, but the second is you reap in a different season than you sow. And so I, like Harry's suggesting, and if you're listening today, part of this call, don't wait on tomorrow, sow now, because whatever you're sowing right now, whether it's a one-on-one relationship, it's a networking opportunity, that's putting seed in the ground that bears fruit down the road. So everything you're doing right now is like planting seeds. It bears fruit in time. Don't worry about you're not seeing fruit in the moment. Count that as joy and trust the Lord for the future. One other quick little thing that we've done, a simple little thing that is very cost effective, I found out, but we made 14 signs for a local hospital. We reached out, how are you guys doing? And, you know, people doing masks and they're taking meals. And I talked to an administrator at one of our local hospitals, and he said, you know, we've got people doing all that. He says, you know, what'd be really amazing is if you guys could make signs, like yard signs, you know, like political signs and posters that go in a yard. He said, if you could make some signs for us that just encouraged our staff, the doctors, all the way to the house. I can't remember the exact term they call it, but it's the house workers or whatever. It's basically everybody who walks in that door, serving people, serving the church, the hospital, serving needs in the community. And so we created 14 signs. There are things like, you know, not all heroes wear cape, or, you know, or thank you, you know, before your feet hit the floor, know that you've been prayed for. And literally today, those signs arrived. It cost me all of $215. You can go online, make these signs, and as soon as we get them, we're going to take them out today. But that's something, again, even a church plant right now could find a way to spend $200, $300 and create some signs like that, whether for a hospital or other essential workers. And we put our logo on there with the hospital logo, right? That's it. We didn't say Mosaic Church. It's just our logo. And we're really not doing it for credit, but we are sowing seeds in a simple way that's, again, personal, missional, and relational with people in our community. So that is an idea. Hey, I want to read this. Daryl Williams, real quick. He said they're developing an essential church launch plan that's getting our team, Inez, back to what you said, fundamentals, collective prayer, discipleship, community engagement, service in personal ways. They think that if they do these things under these circumstances, they're going to be stronger in the future. He adds also that we have thought the same thing, Dale. COVID has launched us. And I think that's certainly going to be one of the takeaways from our time together today. COVID has launched us. By the way, if you're listening or want to get the recording of this, we've created a Mosaics Global Network YouTube channel, and we'll post that here in the next 24 hours. Mosaics Global Network on YouTube, you can find it. One other thing, Harry, I want to bring you back in and say, you know, because finance is such a crucial thing right now. And Harry, along with a couple others in our church, really have done a fantastic job over the last 3-4 years preparing us even for such a moment as this. But you, as well as I know, there's the PPP grant for churches that already exist, and some people will get that, and churches will get that. But, you know, you and I know when that money runs out, you know, an NFL football player in Atlanta, they're giving $3,000 grants to smaller churches in the inner city and different things. And all of that is wonderful. But again, when that money runs out, right, then what? And that's what we wrote about in the book, Structural Innovation on Economics. Maybe from your perspective, having planted a church, listening today, what's kind of a final comment that you might, maybe something we haven't talked about in terms of funding and finance that we can encourage church planters about today?
Well, I think in terms of the actual dollars of it all, you know, they always say that the number one indicator for organizational health, especially amongst nonprofits, is just pure cash reserves. I mean, there's no substitute for just building those reserves because, you know, there's just no telling it. It gives you so many advantages in so many ways. And when Dale was here, man, we just moved across the street. We were going through so many difficulties financially 3 years ago, and it almost, I mean, it was like my most stressful time as a pastor here at Mosaic, just having to deal with these, huge expenses, very little money on hand. And we just had to start in a very disciplined way, start building these reserves. And we would do it, $1,000 at a time. We'd do it just whenever we could do it. We would start putting things away. And thankfully, God, got us to where we are today. And of course, I don't know how long we can last based on what's happening, but I tell you this much, we're probably in much better shape than most churches. And so anything you can do in terms of, because you can't just put a brakes on ministry. It's got to be done wisely. You got to keep doing ministry as best you can, as long as you can, as much as you can, while at the same time keeping one eye out for the organizational health that you will need. I would guess, just like Mark was saying, most churches and a lot of small businesses in America only have enough cash on hand for one extra payroll cycle. And those are the churches, they're going to really have a hard time. And hopefully, if you're a pastor out there and you do have a payroll, that you're applying for that PPP program, because it will extend out 2 months before you have to start dipping into those kinds of reserves. It just buys you time. Everything right now about cash just buys you time. And the more time that you can get out in front of it, the longer you'll be able to sustain.
Again, great advice from a practitioner of 20 years who's doing a fantastic job in helping our church not only survive this time, but thrive in it, minister to the community, and position for the future. Hey, everyone listening right now, we're going to go another 10, 15 minutes or so. We definitely want to be done by a quarter after the hour, but we've got several questions from folks, and I want to make sure we get to them. By the way, Sanchez Fair saying hello from Charlotte, North Carolina. Joel Martinez watching from Minneapolis, Minnesota. And again, Paul Park, Malcolm Griswold says hello from Detroit, Michigan. So many people joining us today, church planners. Again, this will be on the Mosaics Global Network YouTube channel, posted within the next 24 hours to pass along to others. Hey, here's it's not a simple question, but a quick question. Dale, I'm going to ask it of you. Jimmy asked a question earlier and said, hey, he's thinking about and feeling a call. He has ministry experience to plant a church. Obviously, there's concerns in this moment, but his question, ironically, is, he's 62 years old. Are you ever too old to plant a church? That's what Jimmy is wanting to know today. Dale, what would you have to say about that?
Yeah, it's a great question, Jimmy. I would say the answer is 2 parts. You're never too old to plant a church. I think that's the spiritual side of it. But then I think I would apply some practical sides of this to planting a church, which would be, you're never too old, but you're never too old to also partner with someone else to plant a church as well. I think planning a church, I remember when I was with Pastor Harry and Mark, they're like, are you sure you know what you're getting yourself into when you're planting a church? You have to be called to plant a church. You have to be called. And number 2, you have to have a team. You must have a team. And so my encouragement to you, Jimmy, is no, you're never too old. Please move forward in what God is calling you to do. But please do not start without a team. That's what I would recommend. You need a team.
Yeah, that is exactly where my mind went, Dale. The exact same thing. Never too old, but you definitely want to do it as a team. And that's, I don't care if you're 25 years old or 65 years old, you want to do it in partnership in a team. And of course, Inez and Bobby mentioned that earlier. Rooted in relationship is absolutely the best way to go, and the foundation that is. Hey, real quick, here's another question. Let me get it for you. Here it is. Let's see. Can you guys speak to the context of Acts when it comes to shared resources versus the tithes? With the church funded by the tithe or sustained resources, how would you transition a culture of consuming resources to sharing resources and living generously? I think it's a little bit of both, right? In the New Testament, tithes and offerings, selling a property, sharing resources. Bobby, what thoughts do you have on that?
What does it mean to be the church? What does it mean to give our whole lives over, to live a poured out sacrificial life as we lean into Easter on Sunday? What does the walk of Christ look like on that road, carrying the cross for us in and through the darkness of death and out into the fullness of life? And so if a life, a resurrected life for a believer, still lends itself to a life of only caring about themselves and their own well-being, their own safety, their own security, then I don't know if we're living into the fullness of what Christ has called us to. So I think we have to go back very basics to the gospel and invite everybody into the generosity of a poured out life that Christ offers us. And people can get a glimpse of that, then maybe perhaps if they can see God's generosity towards them, they can apply that generosity to their whole lives.
Really good. Paul Park asks this: does anyone have any experiences or thinking about planting online, and what might that look like? What if you're planting right now? May be a great time to plant. You're not thinking about physical space, but virtual space. I know my good friend Chris Bennick down at First Pres in Miami literally launched one of the very first virtual reality churches out of First Pres Miami recently. He's a high-tech wizard, world's foremost authority on AI, and clergy expert, I should say, on AI. But what thoughts do you think? I mean, in some ways, you all are launching right now online, right? What would you say to that question, any of you?
Yeah. Oh, Inés, go ahead, Inés. You're about to say.
Yeah. Thank you, Dale. The online thing, I have a strange relationship with the online thing, because I think what we're finding out right now is that God has made us for human connection and for community. And what we're finding out is it has heightened our need and how God has made us for community. And so I see online technology, I see it as a tool, but I would be wary of completely, and that's just my opinion, right? I do bless and respect how others are using technology, but I would be wary of solely like only doing online church, because of how God has wired us. And we're all finding right now our actual need for human connection, for human touch, for human, we were talking with our Fuller staff the other day, how we just need to be together. And so right now, this crisis is accentuating that, and it's an adaptive challenge for sure. So we do have to adapt. We do have to be resilient. And my word for resilience is how we'll use it, but not like 100% become codependent with it. Because I would be afraid that it would just strip away at some things that we actually need to be with each other when we come back, when this is over. I think right now we're being shaped, and we're being invited by the Spirit to ask, how is it shaping us right now? How is it forming us? And how an online only type of community do our bodies and our psyches and our souls and our hearts were we created just for that? And so balancing all of that, to see how we are interacting towards connection, but that we wouldn't just solely do that. So that's just me.
No, I think you're right. It's a dual, it's a both and, not an either or, right? And you wouldn't want to be fixed to a building, if you will, on the other hand, and permanent residence. On the other hand, you wouldn't want to be fixed online. I know here at Mosaic, it's just an opportunity to enhance what we were already doing, to bring that online, from Bible studies online, to your streaming and content, to relational connection. I think it's a time, like you're saying, to enhance that as a church. And it's forcing the American church to do that, which is probably a good thing in the long run. But we don't get away from the basics, as we've talked about already. Hey, Harry, would you mind bringing on Greg Kappas? Greg Kappas, been a long-term church planner, both here in the United States and around the world. He was our coach nearly 20 years ago. He coached our church, and many others has. I want to get Greg on here just before we close, and make sure he has a chance to say hello. And also, I'm going to ask Greg to pray for us. While we're waiting for Greg to join us today, Yvette says this: thank you for your encouragement. I'm an MDiv online student at Fuller with concentration in Islamic studies. When I met Mark DeMaz years ago, I was planning a Hispanic church and now broadening from there. So she says hello for sure on that. Wanted to make sure to get her comment in there. Again, lots of them, and hopefully got yours in. Try to get all these questions in, balancing between Harry, Alison, and myself. But real quick, while we're waiting for Greg to get on, Harry, I want to share a quick story that really wraps up so much of what we've been saying about funding and finances. Going back to the book of Acts, where you're at, mindset of abundance. Years ago when I was in Honduras, my first missions trip, 36 years ago, I'd been saved for 3 months. I picked up a ball, a little soccer ball, while our team was putting blocks into position in Honduras to build a church building out a block. I was 19 years old, college athlete. I wasn't really interested in laying bricks. So I picked up a little soccer ball and I started kicking it with one little kid. Well, pretty soon that became 3 kids, and then it was 10 kids, and I had to move out of the area, and all of a sudden it was 20 kids, and then it was 30 kids. And I remember finally I had to hold that ball up over my head. I'm marching down the dirt street in Roatan Bay Island in the main city to get to a schoolyard that opened up. And when I got there with that one ball, and when I walked down the street, kids are hanging off my arms. They're trying to get the ball. It was just crazy. I remember thinking, this must be what Jesus felt like when the crowds pushed in on him. And we turned in that schoolyard. And to make a long story short, I organized a little soccer tournament with probably 150, no lie, probably 150 kids that day with that little ball. And as a result of that little tournament, we were able to preach the gospel. And it was then that God taught me a principle. The very first principle I ever learned in ministry is if you can't do it with a ball, you can't do it with a building. If you can't do it with a ball, you can't do it with a building. And yeah, and so, you know, years later, we built a $3.5 million student center at a church that I was a part of. And youth pastors would come in there, they Google, and you look at it, and they're all excited. And I knew what they were thinking. If I had this building, I'd have 600 students in my youth group. But again, I would remind them, look, we didn't just get here. You come with a ball. You start with what you have, and you play with who you got. And if you prove yourself faithful, then God takes you to more and more and more. What a time to return to the book of Acts. All of you have said that in one way or another today. Hey, Greg Kappas is with us on the line. Greg, there he is. Greg Kappas, my good friend. We went to seminary together back in the 80s, mid-80s. And he and his dear wife, Debbie, and Linda and I have been friends for many, many years. Greg was our coach here at Mosaic. So, of course, you know Harry and Alison and Inés very, very well. But, Greg, I'm going to give you kind of just a moment you've been listening. You've been part of this conversation. You've planted or coached church planting both here in the United States, all over the world through Grace Global Network. But what's maybe one thing we haven't said, one type of encouragement for anybody else listening, church planting in the midst of a crisis right now? And then as we wrap up in a moment, I'm going to have you pray for Oneya and Dale and Inés and Bobby, and of course for all church planters in general listening today. But Greg, share with us any words of thoughts or wisdom, advice you might have for us in this time.
I'm kind of just learning from you all, Mark and Harry and your team, and to hear from two different church planting couples or teams is fantastic. I'm behind you all. I think we just got to go back to how Jesus started. Jesus started small and went large. And now what has happened? God has allowed the whole world to be shaken by a small protein that's affected the large group, not only us individually, but the large group. And it's like, you think we would learn, Mark, you're right on target. I believe God's positioning Mosaic Global Network to touch the world with paradigm thinking, where the large group and large worship, we all like that. But the early church was riveted on small, then growing larger. They didn't meet daily for the large group. They meet daily in homes. They met weekly for the large group. And I think with your socioeconomic thinking, the multi-ethnic church influence that Mosaic has, I believe that God's positioning Mosaic Global Network, not only for national, but for international influence, to flip the paradigm again back to New Testament Christianity. And the large group is huge. But what Inés and Bobby and what the other couples talking about from Cincinnati is God's launching us because he's using something small to shake the world that can cause death. And yet we have something small that can shake the world to bring life. If we'll just think through community and Jesus, and how did Jesus do it? He didn't start with the large groups all the time. He started small. The large groups were there, but we've lost our moorings.
Powerful word that the world has given us something, this fallen world is giving us something small that's causing death. But God himself has given us something small, the gospel of Jesus Christ that brings eternal life. What a powerful word. Greg, stay with us for a moment. I want to go around the horn real quick before we close this call. Inés, Bobby, Dale, Oneya, Harry or Alison for that matter. Final words, final thoughts, final encouragement from your perspective as church planters to church planters before we close today. So pick it up. Inés, maybe we'll start with you.
I'm just praying that all of you who are listening now or later, that you will be overshadowed by the Spirit, that the same Spirit that birthed the church in the book of Acts, that gave, it was a Spirit spoken church and also a Spirit sustained church, that it would be the power of that Spirit that would be strengthening your families, offering protection to your pastoral families and your communities as well, and that you would be guided by that living Spirit that is still alive today, birthing things and birthing the kingdom in and through us.
Bobby, how about you?
I'm just going to go ahead and apologize for using your soccer ball story one day.
We heard that so many times, Bobby. If you can't do it with the ball,
when
you can't do it with the ball.
Hey, the thing that's the heaviest on my heart right now, and I'm a teacher, so I'm asking my students what they're doing. And, you know, you have students saying, oh, I'm going to learn how to play the ukulele. I'm going to learn a million different languages while I'm home. I'm going to get in the best shape of my life. And there is this productivity inside of us that just won't stop no matter what. And I want us to take a breath. And I want us to recognize that right now, the call isn't to be productive. The call is to be present. And what that means to be present to is trauma and tragedy inside of our homes, outside of our windows. I think about the book of Nehemiah. And a lot of times we tell that story as the building of a wall, but it really is the rebuilding of a people. And we see that whole process. The first step that Nehemiah takes isn't picking up a hammer and a chisel, but it's bowing down to the ground and being so present with the Lord. It says, when I heard these things, I sat down and wept, and for some days I mourned and I fasted and I prayed. And so the call that I would ask all church planners, we have that DNA that says, are you a go-getter? That's what they're looking for in assessments. Can you just go rally the troops? Will people follow you, charge the hill? And yet right now that DNA has to be forged into another model, a model that allows us to be present to the pain, present to ourselves. Harry, you talked about sowing earlier. Maybe the call that I would say is, are we allowing Christ, are we allowing the Spirit to sow into our souls right now? We'll come out of this shredded, if not. If we continue to just push, we will come out of this with our hearts absolutely torn, ragged to the ground. So allow yourself to have your soul sown into by the Spirit in those still spaces, even in the midst of times such as these. That's the heaviest burden on my heart right now, is for the souls of people.
Amen. Just presence versus productivity. Yeah, Dale.
I just want to share two things. One, just ask for you guys' prayer. We are just kind of released our first prototype. We wanted to get some face shields to a lot of the essential workers in our city and medical departments. And so we're hoping to be able to produce hundreds of these and get them out to people. They need 130,000 in the state of Ohio face shields. That's how much they're out of them. So it definitely is a need. Please be praying for us on that mission. The second thing is for all the church planners and everybody out there, I just want to encourage you. You were called for such a moment as this. You are not alone. You are not helpless. Take whatever you have. Take that ball, like Pastor Mark said, and do something. And I think as Pastor Bobby also said, whatever you do, let it come out of your rest with God. So if you take all those things, take your ball, take rest and prayer with God, and do something, I think, that's the recipe to really stay in tune with what the Lord is doing in this hour.
Amen. Oneya, final word.
Yeah, I just want to echo that God is giving us, those of us who are privileged enough not to have to show up and work in a grocery store, or who have the opportunity to spend time with other people, an opportunity to really be reformed in our spiritual lives. And if we're, as church planners, are not staying closely connected with God, nothing else we do matters. The quality of our online videos, the number of posts we can do, none of it matters unless it all flows out of this deep relationship and this deep identity as a child of God. And so for those of us for who that might have gotten lost in the busyness and the seeking funds and all the things that you have to do as a church planner, this is a time and an opportunity to be strengthened again, to remember your identity and who you are, and then to move forward in strength out of that. And that could be the biggest gift that this tragic situation brings us if we take advantage of it.
Kent Mariachi said this, you're right on track with collaboration. What's keeping us afloat, in addition to the Holy Spirit, is relationships built and now deepening with fellow believers in the different spheres of the city and outside supporters. Our church family is predominantly low income, and yesterday we were able to bless each family with a 15-pound turkey and groceries for Easter dinner, from a blessing with our partnership with the Union Gospel Mission. Also, a local
Awesome.
store donated a significant amount of candy for us to pass out to all the kids in our neighborhood. Half a pound of chocolate apiece. I'm sure the parents appreciate that, but that's another story. But we've also put out after school ministry to kids online, even their limited connectivity options. We've had 3 great meetings already. So the church is alive. It's not going anywhere. It's adapting as it always has. This is not a time for a mindset of scarcity, but of abundance, to connect with the Holy Spirit, to care for your soul, and to, in little ways, through personal, missional, relational ways, engage people, engage the community, sow those seeds that are going to bear fruit long term. Allison's in a different part of the building, so she's just waving. She said there's a lot of noise where she's at. Allison, so appreciate you. Everyone in the Mosaics Global Network, you guys, everybody knows Allison's really the one that runs the show. So we appreciate you, Allison, all you've done. Harry, any final word? And then Greg will get you in for prayer.
Yeah, well, I know there's a lot of people working at the church right now doing food prep still in the warehouse. So I know why it's so busy over there. But, you know, my friend Daniel Henderson has said that prayer is born out of desperation, and that desperation is either cultivated or comes through crisis. And so we're seeing people that are so desperate nowadays. And I've said this for years, you know, that my favorite quote is from Abraham Lincoln, which is, you know, I'm driven to my knees so many times simply because there's no other place to turn. But this is the first time, honestly, I can remember where everybody agrees with me. There's just no place to turn. Usually before, when I would say that, there would always be some people going, yeah, but I still got, you know, and there's all this self-confidence. There's all these things. They think they got enough resources to whatever. But this is the first time everybody is like, yes, there is no other place to turn but God. So please take advantage of the openness of the world in general to a level of desperation that just naturally leads them to want to know who God is. And I love every one of you guys. You guys are awesome.
Well, we certainly love all of you and all the people online that we've interacted with, and many of our friends, some we're just meeting. But thank everyone, thank all of you for what you're doing, for your heart for the Lord, for your passion for the church, and for remaining engaged in this difficult season and keeping that mindset of abundance rooted in our faith in Jesus Christ. Greg, thanks for joining us today. Would you mind, as a long-term friend and more importantly, a coach literally of thousands of churches throughout the world and here in the United States, would you, in a sense, lay your hands on those of us listening, watching, tuning in today, these church planners and planning couples, and just pray a special blessing, and we'll close it out with that. Greg?
You bet. Dear Father, I do pray for all the online participants, for those who will watch this on video later and be struck in the core of their heart. I want to thank you right now for Mark and for Harry and for Alison and their leadership with Mosaics and Mosaic Global Network. I want to thank you for Inés and Bobby. Lord God, I thank you for Dale and Oneya, and for those other listeners in Kent that was visiting from Seattle. What a dear man. Lord, I thank you for the socioeconomic book that Harry and Mark just recently wrote. I thank you for them thinking through our financial issues of how church has got to be done differently. I thank you, Lord, that in the midst of this great time of interviews with 2 wonderful church planting teams, that we can learn from them, that we can be creative, we can think through signage, we can think through how to do food and other ways to reach out to our community to touch people. But yet, Lord, we can also just think the word of God, and you're causing us to stop and reflect. And we love in North America the performance and the production and the big things. And we all love to go to the movie theater, and we love to go to the plays and all the other stuff. But Lord, you forced us right now to realize that a small protein or proteins that can take life, that we got to drive to you who gives life. And Lord, you call the church to not just be large, but you call the church to start with quality by growing smaller to get larger. And thank you for these 2 church planting teams and how they realize that. And their paradigms are already locked in. I pray for others who are thinking largely. It just grieves me living in Phoenix and hearing Mark's story about a team from Wisconsin just packing up after 10 months or a year of working on a large start. And Lord, we like the largeness, but in this time of reflection and this time of dropping us to our knees and our heart, like Harry was saying, we're not only are people agreeing with him, but can we get all of us to agree with you, Lord. You're the God of the universe. You are the leader, and you lead our church plans. And so, Jesus, we ask through the power of your Holy Spirit, through the pleasure and smile of your Father, to continue to bless Mosaic Global Network and Mosaic Church. And thank you for the seeds they're sowing and the people they're influencing, the books that are being written that are helping me learn, Lord, from these precious people. And I pray, Lord, that I can take the information, and others that were listening today or will be watching and listening in the days ahead or watching through video, Lord, I pray we'll take this information to be more effective for Jesus Christ, not only during COVID-19, but afterwards. And Lord, this isn't something that we just hear and listen to, but this is something that we act on. And we all pray in the name of Jesus Christ. Amen.
Amen.
Amen. Amen. Greg, thank you so much. Inez, Bobby, Dale, Oneya, Alison, Harry, as always, thank you. And thanks to everybody watching, listening, participating. Stay in touch with Mosaic's Global Network through a variety of means. Easy to find us on the web. And remember, this video will post to the Mosaic's Global Network YouTube channel within the next 24 hours. God bless all of you. Stay safe. And we'll see you next week at this time with another conversation at Mosaic's Global Network.